to the gaze. I'm glad to be with you on a digital platform of New Europe, platform where we will show you all the significant events in different regions that at the end of the day affect the world globally. And we will speak about it with our experts for you. I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and it's my show, Talk for More Details. And today we will speak about very important and actual item of today's. It's been a year and a half of full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine independent state. And since that time, there's been a lot of changes in the global democratic world. It's been a huge amount of money and military help given by allies to Ukraine to stand still. Today we will talk about the role of diplomacy, the role of military help, and the scenarios of peace plan for Ukraine proposed by different parties and different countries of the world. On what stage the world is right now, we will talk about our special guest. Today I am very welcome in this program US diplomats and very important person since 2017 till 2019 because he was the special representative for negotiations for Ukraine, and also he was US ambassador to NATO. And special person for me because we've been knowing each other since the beginning of the war. It's Kurt Volker. I'm very, very glad to see you again here now in Kiev in this program.
Thank you so much for having me, Ksenia. It's great to be with you, and congratulations on this program and this show.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to see you again because we've been spoken about the predictions, what's going on, what will going on, even before the full-scale invasion. It was, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 2 weeks before the invasion of Russia. And since that time, a lot has changed. So my first question will be your observation. Is it easy for you as a diplomat to predict anything in the situation the world is right now?
Well, yes and no. When it comes to the specific movements day by day, that's very unpredictable. This is a conflict, China's behavior, Russia's behavior. On the day-to-day basis, it's really hard to see, and you just need to react tactically and have your own agenda and advance on that agenda as well. But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, some things are in fact very predictable. Russia under Putin is going to continue his aggression against Ukraine as a nation, as a people, as a country, for as long as he is in power. We have no doubt about that. Second, Ukraine is going to defend its territory, its people, and Ukraine will survive and prosper as a sovereign, independent European democracy. We know that. NATO is going to be the pillar of security in Europe for decades and decades and decades to come. We know that. And the US is going to continue to support Ukraine, despite what we hear about arguments in the United States and in the Congress and domestic politics. US support for Ukraine is going to continue.
To speak about any possible negotiations, I understand it's not maybe the right time. But as you said, the United States and allies are ready for long-term war in Ukraine and on the continent. On the other hand, if we see that Putin all the time changes his aims in Ukraine, what can be the subject for such negotiations as you see as a diplomat?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, I don't see any prospect for negotiations. Russia has made it very clear that they do not intend to negotiate, that they do not intend to withdraw their forces from Ukraine. They still claim Crimea and 4 other provinces of Ukraine as if they are Russian territory. So Russia is simply not prepared to negotiate. So all this talk about pushing Ukraine to negotiate makes no sense to me, because who are they going to negotiate with and about what? I just don't see it. I think that what President Zelensky has done, what the Chinese have done, others have done, is put out some ideas for peace plans, all of which are premised on Ukraine having its sovereignty and territorial integrity. They're premised on Russia withdrawing its forces. And that is simply something Russia is not prepared to do at the moment.
Do you think that the talks about negotiations will be set only according to the situation on the battlefield? Because time after time, we hear some doubtful meanings, especially from the point of view of some politicians, even in the White House, about the future of the support according to the situation on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. You do hear that. And I think it is a mistake for people even to leak that to the press, even if it's what they're thinking, because all that does is encouragement to Russia to keep fighting. Our objective should be to help Ukraine win and to convince Russia that there is no other outcome, that Ukraine will win, and therefore they should stop fighting sooner rather than later. So those kinds of remarks are very, very unhelpful. I also think they're incorrect because there is a majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, who believe it is in the United States' interest for Ukraine to defeat Russia, that this kind of aggression and that Russia represents, the imperialism, the genocide, it has to be stopped. And a majority of Americans think that from both parties. So it's not necessary for people to be worried about sustaining US support. Of course, there are voices on the far right and even some on the far left who are against aid to Ukraine. It's a democracy and there are always different voices, but they do not represent a majority of the people. So political leaders here have the opportunity to draw upon that support of the vast majority of Americans and sustain US support for Ukraine. If you count the votes, you look at the House of Representatives, there are enough Republicans who do not want to support more aid for Ukraine or only with certain conditions, that the Republicans would not be able to approve it alone. But when you combine the majority of the Republicans with the majority of the Democrats, you have more than enough votes to approve this aid package. So I'm sure that in the end of the day, that's what will happen. We should be looking at a package that covers all of 2024. We should be thinking bigger and planning longer. That is an important signal to Russia. It's an important signal to our allies. It's an important signal to Ukraine.
Still, I have one more, let's say, unpleasant question, but I want to ask you. Lots of meetings that I hear from the American politicians, some of the politicians, is the gaze towards European Union when they say that we, the United States, have a lot of debts. So this is not quite a war of the United States, it's the war European continent. So the European countries should have more attention towards what's going on in Ukraine and more help towards Ukraine. Who produces such meetings and what for? And are they value in the society of the United States?
Yeah, well, this is an important point. It has been a long-standing point in U.S. policy with Europe, including at NATO, that European countries need to spend more themselves. They have to carry their share of the burden. And this goes back as long as I can remember, all the way back to the Reagan administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, Clinton administration. It has been a constant theme because Americans don't want to feel like we are paying the bill. We are putting our lives at risk. We are spending the money for Europe, and Europe isn't willing to do it itself. So it's very important for the American people to see that Europe is doing its share. Now, fortunately, in the case of Ukraine, I think it is. I think right now we do have a situation where the Germans, for instance, just announced a multi-billion euro package for Ukraine for all of next year. The European Union has been spending a substantial amount in budgetary support. Many NATO allies, Poland, the UK, Germany, France, have been providing weaponry for Ukraine and training for Ukraine. The F-16s that Ukraine is going to get will be coming from European countries. So there's a lot there. So it's an important point, but fortunately, it's also a good news story right now.
The story about F-16, we will talk about that a little more detailed, but a little bit later. I want to ask you, why still after a year and a half of a full-scale invasion, we see the understanding of the closest neighbors on the border of Ukraine, such as Baltic countries and Poland, that's trying to make their security more and more obvious towards Belarus and towards Russia. But the other countries, for example, like Germany, not doubting, they help Ukraine, and thank you very much for this, but the government of Germany even says that they not have intentions to make their payments to the security more, as it was announced just a little before by European countries. Why is this position? Is that the position only of the representatives of governments or the people too?
First off, there are many things in your question, so let's take them in pieces.
Okay.
First thing is that countries in the eastern part of NATO, Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, and so on, they remember Soviet occupation of their countries. And in the case of the Baltic states, being even incorporated, annexed into the Soviet Union, which they did not want. So they are very, very concerned, and they see it as very real that if Russia is able to prevail in Ukraine, that they are at risk as well. And so they want to do everything possible to build up their defenses, to have forward deployments of NATO forces. They are willing to spend more on defense themselves in order to deter Russia from thinking about attacks on those countries. That's part one. Part two is the West European countries have not truly adopted a sense that Russia's threats to those countries, or even Russia's war against Ukraine, really is a threat to Western Europe. They still have this sense of security, which means that their populations will always question, how much are we going to spend on defense? Do we really need to spend that much? We have so many other needs. We have education, we have health, we have climate. And so there's always pressure not to spend that. Fortunately, that has gotten better over the past 18 months because of Russia's war. They've seen that the dangers are there. They know they have to do more, but it is still a tension between that western part of the alliance and the central and eastern part of the alliance.
But still, we talked about this with you before the war, I mean, the full-scale war, that these countries do understand because they have historical memory. And those countries that are far from the border of Ukraine are not in this contest. But now, don't they understand and don't they see that Putin never forgive, especially those who go against him? The countries of Western Europe provided military help, provided diplomatic help, provided financial help, and still doing this very, very active and saying the words about Putin, not so pleasant that he used to hear. So do they really believe that all of this, during all this year and a half, will be forgotten by Putin when the war stops and how the war stops?
Yeah, I'm not sure they think that far ahead, to be honest. I think that they are looking at their short-term interests. They don't want to provoke Russia. They don't want to be in a conflict with Russia or with Putin. They want to see whether there's a way to reestablish peace. They don't have any control over what happens inside Russia. And I think they still believe in some respect that someday things are going to be normal again. You're going to have normal diplomatic relations. We may disagree with Russia, but we're going to have to live with them because they're there. I think that is just some of the attitude that's there. As I said, I think that this is rather short-sighted and not very strategic-minded. This real strategy has got to be that in order to establish peace and security in Europe for the long run, Russia's imperialism and genocide has to be defeated. Otherwise, it will continue to be a threat, first to Ukraine, but also to other countries. So we actually need to accelerate our efforts to support Ukraine and make sure that Russia's defeated, because that's the only way we will actually get forward to a point. where there is security again.
But still, I don't understand, because you as a diplomat, you are doing a huge job. I'm following your interviews in different international media in support of Ukraine, explaining the situation, not right now, explaining the situation that brought to today's situation in Ukraine, yeah? And I understand a lot of experts, and more of these, a huge amount of international journalists have been here in Ukraine in hot points since the very beginning, who can show the situation from the first sight, I mean, from their own real emotions. Don't they believe their own journalists? Don't they believe their own experts? Don't they believe their own diplomats as you? Why still this informational gap exists in some countries or in some heads of governments of other countries?
Right. I guess to be fair, it's not necessarily an information gap. They have the same information, but it's a judgment gap. I think, take for example, the US administration right now, they worry very much about Russian escalation, either to involve other countries in the war or to escalate to the possible use of nuclear weapons. So they have in place in the US policy several breakpoints of things that we won't do in order to try to convey to Russia, we are not escalating and we don't want you to escalate. Now, again, that's a judgment that they're making, and a judgment that I disagree with, because I think they are misreading Putin. Putin is unable to escalate because he views himself to be at war with the West already. And if he could escalate, he would. He would already be doing it. So I think that we are misreading him and falling really for this bluff that he is making and allowing that to deter us from more decisive action that we should be taking.
He escalated whatever he might escalate, and still doing it each day and each night when the rockets in our sky. But on the other hand, you say that some politicians do really afraid of a nuclear weapon. But beforehand, we heard a lot about bluffing with the nuclear weapon by Putin. And we heard a lot about the answer from the United States or the allies. It might not be a nuclear answer, but still it will be conventional, but very powerful answer. So I don't understand. On one hand, there's a great assurance of Western politicians that they're tough and they're ready to answer. But on the other hand, they try to not escalate Putin's head, I would say like this, just to pretend something. Something for whom? For Ukraine? I mean, nuclear weapon. But something for our neighbors from NATO countries?
Yeah, it's for ourselves, and ourselves meaning a collective transatlantic democratic community. We don't want to see nuclear weapons used anywhere. We don't want to see them used in Ukraine, and we don't want to see the war escalate beyond Ukraine to involve other countries as well. That's the philosophy that's there. And I think that unfortunately, again, it comes back to the question of judgment. They actually, by being so worried about that, prolong the war and prolong the impact of the war on European countries. We should be seeking to end it as quickly as possible by helping Ukraine win. Instead, they say, we'll support Ukraine as long as it takes. That's the wrong way to think of it. We should be helping Ukraine win as quickly as possible. That's what's going to be best for all of our people.
Okay, let's look what's going on the other border, from Belarus border to Poland. All the threats that are heard from Lukashenko and the presence of Wagner Group. There are not much of them, but still there are lots of talks, and not in Ukrainian, but in international media, about the threats towards Poland, because we understand that that might be provocations, that might be some provocations not only on the border, but inside the country. And we really know how Moscow can do it and know how to do it. So this escalation on the border of Poland, what for? And what can be the next step? And what intelligence services say about this?
Mhm. Well, it's a very good question, Ksenia, because I think there's a lot that we don't know about the deal between Putin and Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. We don't know exactly what Lukashenko's role is, and we don't know exactly what the Wagner forces are doing and where they are. There's a lot of uncertainty here. But my own view here is that Prigozhin's rebellion demonstrated Putin's weakness domestically. A lot of people, including in the military and in southern Russia and civilians, agreed with the criticisms that Prigozhin was making of the conduct of the war and the decision to go to war. So I think that actually showed Putin to be in a weak position. I think that he and Prigozhin both needed a way to step back because a conflict between the Wagner forces and forces in Moscow would have been bad for everybody. So that I believe that they then turned to Lukashenko as a fig leaf, as a cover story, so that they could step back. And then this alleged agreement between the Kremlin and Prigozhin, I think, is very, very murky. It doesn't seem to me that either of them, Putin or Prigozhin, is actually adhering to the agreement that they made, and they're just buying more time. And as for the border with Poland, where some Wagner forces have been encamped, I think you could look at that as a bluff, as a way to cause NATO to worry more about escalation or about an attack. It may not even be happening. It could be that that's a place where Lukashenko feels it's safe to have the Wagner group rather than somewhere else that would be more dangerous for him. And also, Lukashenko has been very, very careful not to get Belarusian forces directly involved in the war. I think he worries, and probably with good reason, that if he did, that they would probably turn against him. It would create instability inside Belarus. So he is trying to keep Belarusian forces out of it, and probably also trying to prevent any kind of genuine escalation with NATO.
Talking globally, Kurt, let's be honest about so-called red lines. We've heard about Putin crossed red lines, red lines, and red over red lines. So he's crossing it each day. But I want to ask you, what might be this? It seems like these red lines are moving forward by Putin each time to test the behavior of NATO. And each time he's on top. Because whatever he does, even towards NATO country, yet not crossing the border, but trying to do it with military aircraft or other words or actions, still NATO says, we will answer, we will. My question is, are there really any red lines left?
Well, yes, there are. So as much as what you say is true, I think there's another way to look at it also. You are describing the way it looks from Putin's perspective, that he is able to cross this red line, that red line, NATO doesn't do anything, he feels emboldened, he does it again.
Absolutely.
That's the way he's looking. From the NATO perspective, the way NATO countries are looking at it is, we're responsible to our people, we're democracies, we are responsible countries. We don't want to expand and create wars that we don't want. So we should not be provoked into a conflict that we actually don't want to be in. So the NATO countries feel they've reacted with prudence each time. They haven't been drawn into a conflict. They have taken other measures to communicate, don't do this again, to enhance forward presence, such as we see now with Poland putting a base near the Belarusian border, or with the deployment of NATO forces to the Baltic states. These are ways to try to signal that we have the capability, and if you push too hard, there will be a response. But we're not taking that lightly. We're not just leaping into a conflict, which is, I think, the way the NATO countries view a responsible approach vis-a-vis their own population. So those are the disconnects between how it's seen in Russia and how it's seen in the West.
You know, Putin know how to play for long, and we obviously observing this situation. And we see how Western countries try to cope with Russian propaganda, closing the channels, the broadcaster of Russian propaganda. We see how they're trying to clean the environment inside the cultural sector in their countries that undercover do their intelligent actions or use as intelligence service as a cultural center or whatever. So they're using so-called soft power in different countries. And the great example of this, it's not the part of the European Union, but still it's our neighbor, Georgia. So it's a great example how they took 20% of their land, occupied the territory of Abkhazia and Samacheblo, and still using the soft power through politicians, through society, to grab and hold Georgia like here in hands. So the same situation can be observed in different, even European countries. Do you see such situation in any of them? For example, in Germany.
Well,
not so obvious,
yeah.
but...
Yes, you do see it in Germany. That's a good example. As you said, hard power disguised as soft power through things like cultural centers or media. You have a substantial Russian-speaking population in Germany that is watching Russian media and Russian propaganda, and that does have a direct impact on their voting and their attitudes inside Germany. I think that the grip of Russian propaganda has weakened in Germany over the past year and a half. You now hear Social Democrats and Greens and German government speaking far more critically about Putin and being willing to do things that they were never willing to do before, such as increasing the defense budget, sending arms to Ukraine while the conflict is going on, sending German tanks. So there has been movement in Germany, but there is still an impact from that kind of Russian soft power, as you say. In Georgia, it's even more complicated. The Georgians are very aware that Russia occupies 20% of their territory, and they're very divided over how to respond to Russia's war in Ukraine. The people are very supportive of Ukraine, and they would like to see Ukraine do more. On the other hand, the government is very conscious that Russia could really hurt Georgia. They could retaliate in any number of ways against Georgia. And so they're reluctant to go too far or be too vocal in support of Ukraine from the government side. And that's caused a lot of disappointment and tension within society in Georgia.
I reminded this example just because I understand that maybe I'm mistaken. You will just improve me right now. But I understand that while the European country is trying to defend their borders, factual with the military forces and all these constructions or whatever, tanks, to predict the intruders of foreign country. On the other hand, the actions inside the country still continues. And even with preservation of all the borders, you never know when it bursts out inside the country because he has his hands on this process inside. So how to break this entire intruders completely? Because we understand as long as there are lots of, even frozen, but Russian big money in top capitals of European countries, these countries cannot cope with all of this inside of their own state.
Yeah, I think that has changed. I think the way you say that, I would have agreed with you 2 years ago, that the influence of all that Russian money in Western capitals is so big that it is putting a caution onto or restraint on Western policy. I think since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February, I do think that has changed. I think there have been more sanctions put in place that make it difficult for that Russian money to exist and to exert any influence. Oligarchs have been forced to sell off certain assets. Governments have been emboldened because of the support of their public for helping Ukraine. We've seen all kinds of decisions made in Western capitals to support Ukraine that would never have taken place 2 years ago. The decision about candidate status for the EU, the provision of all different types of arms from Western countries. I remember back in 2017 when we started talking about this, not a single Western country was willing to provide lethal defensive arms to Ukraine. And I led the effort inside the US government to change that policy against the arguments of France and Germany. And we succeeded in getting that done. And now we see that France and Germany, among many others, Poland, Ukraine, Poland, UK, and so forth, are all providing lethal arms to Ukraine now.
But still, I want to stress on all the possible risks and their understanding by let's say about European politicians, because in the United States, I see that it's a clear position towards what's going on here. European countries, do they really understand deeply the risks with, for example, Georgia again, Moldova, let's say Kazakhstan, let's say Armenia? It's the closest to the border, and other countries that are used right now by Putin through the politicians, such as Hungary, sometimes Austria, some other Balkan countries, in the time that is appropriate for Putin, just to, how to say, intruding the stick into the hole, and trying to do whatever is needed to Putin.
Yeah, I don't think they've fully gotten there yet. I think attitudes have shifted a bit, but a point that I've made in many reviews and articles is that for Putin, these gray zones are green lights. He views that as a sign of invitation almost, that he can go ahead and interfere in all of those countries and then use them as platforms for interfering in the rest of Europe. And I don't think that that is fully grasped and accepted yet in all European capitals. There's more understanding for that. I think the decision about candidate status for Ukraine is a reflection of that. But still, the EU needs to take a position, I think, that it has to close all of the gray zones. And as you said, Georgia, the Balkans, Moldova, Ukraine, all of that. And NATO should be taking the same view. And unfortunately, with NATO, we are again at a stage where NATO is deterred by Russia. NATO is not willing to move more directly on membership for Ukraine and for other countries, which in the long run is really the only way we're going to have peace in Europe again. So we need to be articulating that vision now, getting people used to it and building toward it, rather than just drifting as we seem to be.
Let's talk about another instrument that is obviously effective, but not in the way we expect it to be. It's sanctions. A huge amount of packages already, but still we see the opportunities to get somehow money for producing military equipment and weapon to shoot the missiles on Ukraine. And we see the opportunities to circumvention of this sanction. And some countries or don't have opportunities to cope this situation, or they just close their eyes on the situation because they see some pragmatic interest in this situation and explaining it as a non-perfect legal base to stop the circumvention of sanctions. What is your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a mixed picture on sanctions. Clearly, we can see in some ways how sanctions have had an impact. Less money is going into the Russian budget from oil and gas sales than was going in before. This has led to budget deficits. It's led to the decline in the value of the ruble, which we've seen this week. It has also had an impact through the availability or Russia's ability to access certain critical components like microchips and rare earth metals, which it needs in order to continue producing its weapons for the battle against Ukraine. So it has had a lot of direct impacts. It forced Putin to clamp down inside Russia even more than he already had in order to assert more control over some of the economic levers. Uh, Now, you're right, that's part of the picture. But the other part is that there's a lot of sanctions evasion, and a lot of people are making money as a result of sanctions. And just one data point that I saw just a few weeks ago was that the decline in EU trade with Russia because of sanctions is exactly equal to the increase in EU trade with Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. So I think it's pretty obvious that there are people who are buying from the EU and reselling in Russia.
Mhm.
They're probably making a profit. Probably comes at higher cost to Russia. And yet you see that this is a form of sanctions avoidance. But even saying all of that, the sanctions are important. They do have an impact. We need to keep them in place. And they need to be seen as just one tool among many, including the military support for Ukraine that we are giving.
You just mentioned and reminded about the gas and oil and the decision of European Union to get rid of Russian gas and oil. And lately, I saw very interesting analytics about, let's take example as Germany. Germany get rid of Russian gas, but Germany at the same time moved all their enterprises into India. India that are buying a huge amount of Russian gas. So now Germans enterprises just work in India on Russian gas bought by India. So they're not losing money, obviously. Or it's not the situation as it is. It's more complicated. What's your opinion? It's just one example.
That's exactly. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I would say. It's more complicated. This is not a wholesale replacement of European purchases of Russian gas. It is substantially lower, different. Nonetheless, what you said is true. Some German businesses will have done exactly that, moved to India, and India is importing Russian gas. But it's not a replacement for what had been happening. And what is happening is Qatar and others, Norway, UK, they're increasing gas production to replace the Russian gas. And so there's no need after this war is over, whenever that is, to return to buying Russian gas. There will now be LNG alternatives already in place that will provide a reliable supply for Europe without having to turn back to Russia.
Okay, let's talk then a little bit wider geographically and see what's going on in communication with the so-called global south. And not about India or China right now. I want to ask you about the situation on African continent and with the Latin American countries. We see the huge fight for the attention of this country from Russian Federation, from Putin, and from his diplomacy, so-called diplomacy, and from the global West. So who is winning right now? And what's the weak sides of this communication with these countries? Because I want to stress that the representatives of these countries are the participants of United Nations Council. So they vote for resolutions and about Ukraine too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a complex picture. Again, the countries in the global south do not approve of aggression, and they support the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that's very clear. And we saw that even at the meeting in Jeddah that took place recently with 40 countries taking part with Ukraine to hear about what's going on in the war. At the same time, they don't necessarily think it is their responsibility. They often feel that the Security Council, the wars in the world, they've all been driven by Europe. The colonialism that they experienced has been driven by Europe. So this is not their problem as they look at it. They don't disagree with the Ukrainian cause, but they also don't feel that they are invested in it. That may change. I think it has changed a little bit already based on the war crimes that we've seen, the atrocities that Russia commits, the kidnapping of children. And I think, as we saw with the meeting in Jeddah, Russia did not feel comfortable being there Ukraine did feel comfortable being there. And I think that gave some encouragement to them that, well, actually, we do have some sympathy for Ukraine in this.
What are the strong sides of the United States diplomacy in this situation? Because we see that as long as Putin travels to the African countries, at the same time, the American diplomacy travels to African countries and try to set their points of view on the topical situation. So it's very active right now.
It is. I think it could be more active on the Western side. I think that there ought to be more and higher level visitors from Europe and the United States to these African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries. And it ought to be a consistent part of our dialogue, not only about Ukraine, because they obviously have their own interests and we should be engaging with them about their interests, but this should be a constant theme. And I think there is more we could be doing than we are.
Very important role of China, not only in the ending the war in Ukraine, because they're supposed to be as peacekeepers and trying to be a negotiator. At least they announce that they're ready to be a negotiator in this process. But on the other hand, we see that they are testing the United States, testing NATO, and they are observing, according to Chinese philosophy maybe, how it ends. So then they will decide how to act towards Taiwan and towards other tough questions between the Western world and the global South world. So what do you see in this communication between the United States and China right now? And how influential China is now in the question of peace agreements, maybe peace negotiations towards Ukraine?
Yeah. So this is a very important question because I think a lot of people look at China and ask themselves, well, are they going to help Russia? What is their view on Ukraine? Are they going to invade Taiwan? They ask about all those things, and they're asking about it from their own perspective. We don't want to see Russia help China. We don't want an alliance between Russia and China. We're concerned about the Belt and Road Initiative. We're concerned about Chinese technology. You have to take a step out of your own shoes and look at the world through Chinese eyes. What do they see? They have their own interests, which are not the same as American or Russian or Ukrainian interests. They have their own interests, and they're quite patient and determined about pursuing their own interests. So, for example, China doesn't really help Russia very much in this war. I know a lot of people talk about it, but when you look at it, they really don't. And I think that's because they don't have any interest in doing so. When they put out a peace plan, they would like to see the war over. They'd like to see a situation where there is stability again, where Ukraine's territory is recovered, and the West goes back to sleep, because then they can focus on their own interests in pushing back on Western dominance of the global economy, and they can focus on their interests in Southeast Asia and Taiwan. So that is where I think they are. When they look at Russia's war against Ukraine, I think they see that Ukraine has proven very, very strong and very difficult to take. And that is a lesson for them about Taiwan. They see that Russia has weakened itself by attacking Ukraine, and they don't want to do that. They don't want to weaken themselves. And they see that Ukraine, where Russia has attacked, has largely been destroyed. These villages, the economy is way down. China doesn't want to absorb a destroyed Taiwan. It wants to absorb a rich Taiwan, like it did with Hong Kong. And so they are looking at this all very, very differently from the way you or I or others in the West would look at it. And I think we always have to keep that in mind. That means that we actually have the ability to work with China if we understand what their interests are. There may be overlap with some of our interests. And I think one part of that is this peace plan that they've put out, with the first sentence being sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's already a good starting point for potentially constructive talks with China. Maybe they can convince Putin at some point that he has to respect that too. And if not, I think it gives a basis for their understanding why we are supporting Ukraine.
But you say that China doesn't help globally to Russia, or maybe openly doesn't help Russia. Okay, let it be so. But on the other hand, do you agree that China is not interested in the victory of Ukraine, complete victory of Ukraine? Because we understand it will weaken completely Russian Federation. So how they manage to balance in this situation, I mean the Chinese, and what's their real, I would say, hidden interest in the continuation of this war? How you see it as a diplomat?
Yeah, so I don't think China cares whether Ukraine defeats Russia or Russia defeats Ukraine. I just don't think they see that as them having a real interest in that. And if Russia's defeated, that makes a weaker Russia and puts China in a stronger position vis-a-vis Russia, even more so, particularly when you look at the resources that it wants to buy from Russia and the population of the eastern half of Russia and Asia. So China really doesn't care. I think it would like to see a return to peace and stability so that there's a return to normality in the global economy and a return to domestic focus in the West rather than a globally active West. So I think getting a peace, getting a settlement is in China's interest, and they see that. But how that comes about and who wins, who loses, they really don't care.
You know, I remember our discussion of the current situation right before the invasion of Russian Federation. It was interesting. Today, I looked through the interview with you 2 weeks before the invasion, and one of lots of interesting points. I just don't want to stop on this, but one of this, it's interesting because I want to know and understand how the situation changed completely in the United Nations. You answered in one of my questions that Russia doesn't approach international diplomacy the way other countries do, and they mostly use the United Nations and other international organizations as an opportunity to stage a theater or maybe a circus, a performance, and not a reflection of what they will or will not do. More of this, all the decisions are made behind closed doors without public discussion in the Kremlin, and further actions are taken, but not without diplomacy decisions on the openly. Yeah. So how the situation with the United Nations changed during this half a year? Because Russia, as we can see and observe, still uses this opportunity as a theater.
Exactly. Yes. No, it's an interesting look back at 18 months ago, what we were saying, because I would say very little has changed in terms of Russia's approach. Russia just looks at this as theater, and it's very good at promoting its own propaganda. It looks at the world as a stage where it can promote its ideas that it wants to promote, even while it knows that it's a lie and it knows that it's doing something else. It's all just theater. What has changed in the last year and a half is that it doesn't work as well anymore. Countries are more aware that Russia is lying most of the time and saying things in order to influence rather than because they're real. So the effect of this theater is diminished, but it's still there.
And I remember that you said that Putin will check all his actions before doing something a million times, because he's very pragmatic and he will count each risk. So at the end of our discussion, we understood that unlikely there will be full invasion because he accepts all the decision only by himself. Since that time, you change your attitude towards the opinion leadership in the Kremlin and his environment, and about his ability to count all the risks. What changed in your perspective of this? Perception of this?
Well, thank you. And on this one, let's just be blunt and say I was wrong. I got that one wrong. We've had to relook at what we think here. Several things are different from what we said then. First off, it is now clear that Putin's advisors, the intelligence services, the military, and so forth, lied to him. They did not want to disclose that their military was in far worse shape than he thought it was. They did not want to contradict his assertion that Ukrainians are weak and confused and Nazis and will not fight. So they weren't telling him the truth, so he had bad information. Second, I think the impact of COVID seems to have been greater than we expected. I think he became emotional and paranoid. And I think he also felt that he had limited time in which to try to accomplish the goal of rebuilding the empire. And now that the war has gone badly, I think he feels that he can't go back. I think he feels that the only way out is forward. So he's just going to keep going and keep fighting and keep fighting, even if it is irrational and if it's hurting Russia by doing so. So a lot of things, I think he did act irrationally and emotionally in a way that wasn't expected. Those are some of the reasons. And now I think that that is exactly what we should expect from him.
In 1991, I remember a lot of talks, even though I was quite young, but I still watched TV and read the newspapers. And I remember that the West was afraid of collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a huge country, and no one could predict, like a nuclear country can spread up, what's going to be with this chaotic environment. So now it's the same situation. Do West really afraid more the collapse of the Russian Federation than the nuclear threats from Putin?
Well, both. I think that people in the West, and you hear this occasionally from some of the intelligence community, they worry about both. They worry that the collapse of Russia would lead to fragmentation, internal conflict, refugees, loose radioactive and fissile materials, loose nuclear weapons, perhaps. So they worry about all of that with disintegration. They also worry about any possible nuclear use. There, we actually have some ability to deter, and I think it's been effective. As you mentioned, strategic nuclear deterrence still works. The Russians know it would destroy Russia. And even a tactical nuclear weapon would result in direct response against Russian forces, probably conventional means. They don't want that either. So I think the deterrence of the nuclear use is working. But fragmentation is something people worry about as well, and it is quite possible. And what I would just say about that, if I were speaking to some of these analysts in the West, is you can't control it. You may worry about it, but you can't make it happen and you can't stop it from happening. So don't base your policy on that. Base your policy on what you can actually achieve, which is to help Ukraine defeat Russian forces in Ukraine and reestablish control over its borders.
I want to ask it this way. Having all the facts on the ground and according to what's going on with the counteroffensive and with the providing of the weapon that's extremely necessary right now on the battlefield, and with all this diplomatic tries by other countries, different actors in this play, I would say, how will you see the perfect scenario of the final cut of this war?
Well, I think what is likely is not perfect, but it's good. Ukrainian forces will eventually be able to disrupt Russia's ability to support its forces in the field. Whether we're talking about Kherson province, Zaporizhia province, Crimea, the destruction of Russian fuel, ammunition, supply lines, these lines of communication, is ongoing and it will continue. And it's going to reach a tipping point sometime when Russia can't sustain its forces in the field anymore. And I think that tipping point will mean Russia will have to pull back some of its forces. And this is going to cause some soul searching in the Kremlin. What just happened? And what do we do now? What did Putin get us into? So I think you'll see the disruption of the supplies. I think you'll see the need for Russia to pull back. And I think you'll see some kind of political change in Russia And that's probably the way this plays out.
The scenario of complete returning to the borders of 1991, including the Crimea, is possible in the nearest future, or more likely any compromises from the Western point of view, because from Ukrainian side, there's no compromises announced by the government and by people of Ukraine. So how do you see, is there any possibility of the middle point somehow or not?
No, I don't. Nobody in the West has the ability or the interest in giving away Ukrainian territory. It's not the West's territory. It's Ukraine, and only Ukrainians can make decisions about their territory. And as I said just in an interview yesterday for the U.S. media, it's not about land only. It's about the people that live on the land. And we've seen what Russia does in the areas that it occupies. It kidnaps children, it murders civilians, it creates absolute destruction. And Ukrainians are not going to allow that to happen to any of their people. So I don't see this idea of giving away territory as something that the West can do or that Ukraine would do. And moreover, I don't see it as possible to get the 91 borders back with Putin in charge. I don't think he would ever agree to that, which is why I think the scenario of change in Russia is probably the way this plays out. We just don't know how long that will take. But with change in Russia, then I think it is possible to get those 91 borders back.
We have a lot of military help from the United States, but still the decision regarding, for example, Abrams took a long way, and F-16 delayed again, even with our partners from European Union. So why is that? What do you think about these delays and each time different explanation of the situation? Because I want to remind you, I want to remind you that your experts and your representatives said that no NATO operation would ever get into actions without support from the sky.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. And why the delays? First off, there's the delay in making a decision, which went on for a year or more, year and a half, unnecessarily. We could have made that decision much earlier, and that would have gotten the equipment there sooner. So that's the first one. This fear of escalation caused delay in the decision making. Second is the actual difficulty, the complexity of getting and moving these systems, and then them being usable by the Ukrainians, meaning training, meaning logistical supplies and support for the equipment, security for the equipment, maintenance and the techs who know how to work on and sustain the equipment. So it's a complex picture, and that does take some time. And then the third thing is the lack of a sense of urgency. I don't get the feeling that our governments in the West are, as we say, lighting a fire underneath the bureaucrats every day, saying, move it, move it, move it. You don't get that sense of urgency, which there needs to be. Ksenia, thank you so much. This has been a great interview.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I will save our prediction for our next conversation as previous.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Was glad to see you again.
Thank you.
So our today's guest was Kurt Volker, diplomat and is leading expert in United States foreign and national security policy. He was the United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 till 2019. And also U.S. Ambassador to NATO in 2008 and 2009. And I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and it was my show, Talk for More Details. And if you like our episode, just press like button. If you didn't like it, just write in the comments why. And of course, press the bell to be the first to see the most up-to-date information. And don't forget to subscribe to the Gaze platform on YouTube and our social networks. Thanks again, and keep in touch.